If you've been following sports news over the last week or two, you're likely familiar with the story about NBA player Meyers Leonard, who uttered an anti-Semitic slur while playing a video game being streamed online. Meyers was immediately called out and condemned forcefully by the NBA, the Miami Heat, countless organizations and people, and consequences for his actions were brought about quickly. Initially sidelined and fined, he was traded earlier this week to a different team from which it appears he is likely to be cut. Words matter. What we say matters. Which is why, more than Leonard's words, I want to raise up the words with which Julian Edelman chose to respond. In an open letter to him, Edelman wrote the following: "So we've never met. I hope we can one day soon. I'm sure you've been getting lots of criticism for what you said. Not trying to add to that, I just want to offer some perspective. I get the sense that you didn't use that word out of hate, more out of ignorance. Most likely, you weren't trying to hurt anyone or even profile Jews in your comment. That's what makes it so destructive. When someone intends to be hateful, it's usually met with great resistance. Casual ignorance is harder to combat and has greater reach, especially when you command great influence. Hate is like a virus. Even accidentally, it can rapidly spread. I'm down in Miami fairly often. Let's do a Shabbat dinner with some friends. I'll show you a fun time." He's such a mensch. In his response, Edelman was modeling for us all what is perhaps the very best way to communicate when we find ourselves seeking to critique or rebuke another person. Words matter. That idea that words matter is foundational in Judaism, which reminds us that speech is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. So much so that speech was the vehicle by which all of existence was created. God literally spoke the world into being. God said, "Let there be light," and there was. But there's more to it than just the words alone. Consider this week's Torah portion, the very first in the book of Leviticus, this book which spends countless verses focused on the establishment of the system of ritual sacrifice, the means by which our ancestors would be able to connect to God, opens in a peculiar way with what appears to be a notably grammatically sloppy sentence. Vayikra el Moshe, vayidaber Adonai elav me'ohel moed lemor. God called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying. In just one sentence, the verse seems to repeat its main point 3 times, that God spoke to Moses. But instead it says God called, Vayikra, God spoke, Vayidaber, and God said, Lemor. Couldn't it just have said God spoke to Moses and then moved on to the good stuff? Of course, we know the answer is no. Anytime there appears to be something additive or extraneous in Torah, our tradition reminds us that nothing in Torah is unintentional. If it appears redundant, it's not. We just have to dig a little deeper to understand what's really happening. According to the ancient rabbis and then Hasidic commentators a bit later, the use of those 3 words, calling, speaking, and saying, in their particular order is of particular and critical importance. By their use, we come to see the Torah's understanding that more than what we say, it's how we say what we say that ultimately matters. Those 3 words aren't synonyms for the same word, but rather each one articulates a different aspect of how we should communicate, first by calling, then by speaking, then by saying. The first, calling, Vayikra, directs our focus toward connection, the sort of intention or tone we're trying to set with the receiver of our message, so that they're able to hear what comes next. The second, speaking, Vayidaber, focuses on the one to whom we are directing our message, to bring them into the conversation so they know, or perhaps better said, feel included, acknowledged, known. And the third saying, Vayomer, is the one that actually imparts the message we're attempting to get across. We need to note that it's not until the very last form of speaking that we're invited into consideration of what we are actually there to say. The Torah understood a deep, eternal truth in this, that a message means nothing if it isn't received, and that the success of that receptibility relies primarily not on the content of the message, but rather on the method by which the message is delivered. But in today's world of nasty Yelp reviews and bombastic social media complaining, we can forget that simply airing out our grievances over the internet airwaves may give us an outlet to express our outrage at any given or perceived offense against us or our moral sensibilities. But this method of so-called communication does nothing to actually affect change. To do that, there has to be actual interfacing, that good old one-to-one, person-to-person contact, which is hard and it's never fun. Whatever side of it we're on, we tend not to like it. It means we have to be vulnerable. That's one of the reasons Edelman's response stood out to me. He was inviting Leonard into a personal connection with him. He didn't spew out condemnations about him in the third person. He engaged with him instead personally. And not just as an offensive anti-Semite, but as a full, valued human being. At the end of the day, if we are actually interested in catalyzing change and not just stimulating our own sense of self-righteousness, we do well to take Leviticus's three-part directive of calling, speaking, and saying to heart. After all, how likely is a rebuke to be heard or integrated if we don't consider how we're offering our message? One may have something of great concern to share, but if their words immediately put the receiver on the defensive, all that will happen is that the receiver will shut down, deflect, or worse, go on reverse attack. Tone matters. That connection, the connection making at the beginning, it matters. Vayikra, the calling, it matters. So too if one has a complaint to issue, but if all they do is fill up the space with themselves without acknowledging the humanity of the other, the identity of the other, bringing in consideration of the other, then the receiver is all the more likely simply to discount whatever critique is being presented, considering it much more about the complainer's own personal agenda or issues than about a concern that has to do with them and their well-being. Bringing the other into the conversation with us, that speaking, that vayidaber, it matters. Because without the calling and without the speaking, saying proves nothing more than wasted words. And truthfully, we'd do better to just save our breath. All too often, we're so quick to draw upon our offended sensibilities, easily issuing declarative judgments that make us feel powerful and righteous. But in the end, we lose sight of the more noble value that really should undergird any critique. The hope that a correction can be made, a real apology might be issued, and then, of course, that forgiveness might follow. Otherwise, we're left no better off than where we were before. There's another important teaching embedded in this virtue of connecting, speaking, and saying, which brings us back to the larger context of the book of Leviticus itself. What's Leviticus all about? It's about establishing the practice of ritual sacrifices. In Hebrew, korbanot, the offerings that kept the people in relationship with God. The root of that word korbanot is karov, and it means drawing near, getting close. So when the verse that introduces the idea of the sacrifices to the people begins with calling, speaking, and saying, we come to see that such a method isn't just an effective, albeit transactional, communication strategy for the sake of getting a desired result. Ultimately, it is the recipe itself for how to be in relationship with each other, how to get close to each other. Something else happened in the news over the past week that unfortunately didn't get nearly as much press as it deserved. As you might remember, last summer, the actor Nick Cannon spoke a number of grossly anti-Semitic remarks on his podcast and was fired from Viacom CBS for it. But a number of rabbis reached out to him and offered to be in conversation with him about his remarks, to offer insight into why they were so dangerous. Because of how they offered the invitation, Cannon decided to meet with them. And over the past year of intensive learning, he has just created a new partnership called the Black and Jewish Entertainment Alliance, designed to foster dialogue and mutual understanding between and through both groups. On his navigation over the last year, Cannon said, "I'm on this journey of atonement, not to get a job, not to gain any more money because that's not what's needed here. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do." I'm not sure any of that would have happened had everyone slipped into the simple cancellation proclivity of so many today. Words matter, and how we use them matters too. Whether we will choose to use them as weapons of separation or as facilitators of repair and restoration is ultimately up to each and every one of us. I think if we can remember the simple advice of call, speak, then say, perhaps we'll find it easier to choose the better, truly more righteous way in the end. Shabbat Shalom.